Thank you all for sticking around, for being troopers and staying with us. And I want to thank my panel here. Ted Glasser from Stanford University, professor of communication. He focuses on press accountability and responsibility. We'll figure out in a few minutes whether there is any of that anymore. Dietram Scheufele, who is the John E. Ross Professor of Science Communication at the University of Wisconsin. He's written extensively on media coverage of nanotechnology and other scientific and high-tech issues. Russ Dalton, Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine, whose work focuses on the role of citizens in the political process. And Peter Bhatia, who is the editor of the Oregonian down in Portland. He's former president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, current president of the board that accredits J schools, and just came from Boulder where he was doing that. He's on the board of directors of the American Press Institute. He was born down in Pullman, raised in Pullman, worked here in Spokane in media, and most importantly, is the chairman of my advisory board. So, so thanks to all of you. When I was sitting in the audience during the last panel, I was doing what we tell all of our students not to do, and that is I was surfing around on the web. Sorry, those of you who were on that panel. I was listening, multitasking and all of that. And I came across a couple of things, which is what we were trying to show you. One was our friend Rush Limbaugh now has a comic book. I saw a headline that said, Current TV is building a new TV studio in New York for Keith Olbermann, who was recently fired by MSNBC when it was bought out. And Olbermann has launched his own new website called, now listen closely to my enunciation, FOK News Channel, F-O-K News Channel, which is supposedly friends of Keith, of course, has nothing to do with anything else. You know, what more is there to say, right? I think we can just stop now. It pretty much sums everything up. Russ, what does this say about where we are? Oh, by the way, because I'm a journalist masquerading as an academic, and I have a journalist here and others who dabble in media, and because we're talking about media and politics and civility, we thought we'd do it more as a format of a TV interview show to show that you actually can do one of these moderately civilly. So please, guys, no name calling, okay? But Russ, what does this mean?
Well, let me add a little reflection too on what we've talked about today. The perspective I take away from part of our discussion is there's a concern about the civility of Americans. I worry less about the average person than I worry about the civility of the media and the people who produce shows and the view that they have of the American public. The good example are the two cases that you gave. You know, the idea of what it takes to sell news seems to be controversy, polarization, hyper-partisanship, and I think that's part of the reason why, if you look at the short-term view, that might sell newspapers or that might get people to turn in. But what we've seen over the last 30 years or 25 years is a dramatic decline in public trust of the media, the belief in the honesty and fairness of the media, the confidence that they are telling the truth and the whole truth. And I'm kind of struck by the change not in the public discourse of citizens, but the public discourse of the media. Just as a kind of shock as I was listening to this, it made me think back to my first job, which was to do public opinion research for the U.S. Information Agency. And one of the first directors of the agency was Edward R. Murrow. My guess is if Edward R. Murrow saw what goes on in television today, he'd roll over in his grave. That the media is part of a large part of our problem because it accentuates the diversity, and very consciously so. A recurring theme I hear from politicians that we invite in is the story of TV producers who have them on and say, cut the bipartisan bullshit. We need more red meat from you. And I think having a discourse in America where you have MSNBC, or now Fox TV, Fox TV, and even on CNN, the balance on CNN is to have one person from Fox and one person from MSNBC, and who yell at each other in face to face. So I leave the day with more trust in the average person than I have in the average television producer. And I think they're very short-sighted because they're losing the trust and confidence of the American public.
The other day, I think 2 days ago, Mike Huckabee, some of you may have heard, told an interviewer that because Obama grew up in Kenya, that had shaped his worldview, and that he'd grown up hearing his parents talking about how good the Mau Maus were and what imperialists the Brits were. Now, of course, Obama didn't grow up in Kenya. He went to Kenya for the first time when he was in his 20s. But this is the kind of thing from a man Huckabee, who had denounced the whole birther movement, but he's back there on a talk show. Ted, how does the media, or how do audiences, the public, separate this wheat from the chaff? How do they separate this noise, this nonsense, from facts?
With great difficulty. It brought to mind Stephen Carter's presentation last night when he talked about the importance of being clever. And I think the importance of being clever is not only in the things we say, but in how we interpret the things other people say. And maybe we're not giving Fox enough credit. Maybe they're being ironic when they say we're fair and balanced. Probably not. Let me strike a note of optimism and then put that in the larger context of, and I'd be curious to get Peter's reaction to this, the larger context of the collapse of the institution of journalism, which I want to keep separate from the proliferation of journalists. Journalism, as you know, is going through some very exciting and troubling changes. We can focus on Fox, we can focus on CNN. I'm as disturbed as anyone here, not only with Fox, but poor Anderson Cooper's gone off the deep end in the last couple of weeks. He spent 2 weeks calling Mubarak a liar. Last night he began his calling Gaddafi a liar. And you wonder where he was for the last 39
Can I just go back there? Did you say poor Anderson Cooper?
Yeah, poor Anderson Cooper. Anyway, the point is that you can focus on CNN and you can focus on Fox. But on the other hand, the New York Times has never been stronger. The Wall Street Journal is in good shape. NPR produces high-quality broadcasts every day. So, there is high-quality journalism being produced in the United States. I think the question we need to confront in the context of civility and elsewhere is what do we do to sustain the kind of journalism we want to sustain that the marketplace will no longer sustain for us? I don't think that there is going to emerge a new business model for journalism. And I think we need to confront the fact, and I think we're beginning to. In fact, we're beginning to ask questions that were simply not on the table even a decade ago about alternatives to business models for journalism. And I'm not talking about state control of the media, but I am talking about a role for the state to play in sustaining forms of journalism that the marketplace no longer sustains. All of a sudden, and it is really suddenly, we're beginning to take those questions seriously. Those questions we couldn't even ask those questions a decade ago. And this has a lot to do, I think, with questions of civility, because the kind of journalism I think we want to sustain is the kind of journalism that takes civility seriously in a particular way, and in a way that journalism has not been able to take it very seriously. I won't go on too much longer, but just to make a quick point. If we understand civility as involving mutual respect, which has been a definition that's been used several times today, then I think, and Josh Cohen was touching on this, I think a very important part of civility is inclusion. And Josh made reference to that with reference to John Rawls, but I want to make reference to it to a different political theorist, philosopher, Iris Marion Young, who understands democracy in a fundamentally communicative way. And maybe later in the panel, when I have a little more time, I want to talk about how journalism has not been able to deal with the question of inclusion very effectively, and therefore not be able to deal with the issues of civility very effectively, and what might be done to make journalism more inclusive. So one thing I want to try to do is document the instances of exclusivity in journalism, and then talk a little bit about the opportunities for inclusion. And I wanted to conclude later in the panel with a particular suggestion. I know a number of you here are coming to this conference with a background in libraries, and I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between libraries and journalism. I think there's an emerging relationship that we ought to think seriously and creatively about. It's telling, I think, that journalism is increasingly adopting the vocabulary of libraries. We talk about curating in journalism in ways we hadn't only a few years ago. I mean, there are mergers and combinations and collaborations popping up now that we didn't anticipate before. And with that comes a whole new vocabulary that I think we need to begin to take very seriously.
And since so many of you are from libraries, let me just point out that my new book came out last month, so you'll all want to be ordering. I had lunch today
which you can get for free online, right?
I had lunch with the news director and station manager at one of the local stations today. And they asked me, what do you think of what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I think you guys are the strongest in town. You do the best journalism in town, et cetera. And the station manager said, well, why are our ratings down? Peter, is that kind of part of the problem? Are people turning away from actual journalism?
Yeah, Ted certainly alluded to it, and I very much agree with that notion. It's not as bad as you read in the press. I was laughing with a colleague the other day about, wow, everybody's written the obituary for newspapers, and it's all been by newspaper people. Nobody's writing the obituary for TV or radio because that's not a story they're going to do. And so in a lot of ways, we're our own worst enemies in that. But I think in the context of this conference, it's a particularly important part of what's been lost. I've been working in newspapers longer than I can remember, and I've always tried to practice it with sort of a fundamental philosophy that we're a guest in people's homes. And that's particularly true when you're slapping the thing down on the doorstep every morning, as we still do, and as we still will for a long, long time. And I think a lot of that, as this sort of cacophony of media has grown up around it, whether it's, Russia's even on the Golf Channel, for goodness sake, and this cult of personality around the people who deliver the news, whatever the news is, has really had an impact on that, and has really had an impact on what we do. It's derisive to be part of the mainstream media. I'm actually quite proud to be part of the mainstream media and plan to be until I hang it up or they throw me out the door, because I'm not willing to let go of the fundamental work that we do. As Ted said, there's a lot of terrific journalism being done around the country still, and some of it's being done on the web, which I applaud and welcome. Part of the problem is this sort of all-encompassing definition of what is a journalist. And it's really interesting. In Oregon, we have this, what I consider, strange executive session law. And in fact, reporters can be in executive sessions of government agencies, but can't report anything that they witness in the executive session unless they go out and verify it independently from the executive session. And I've always thought that was sort of bizarre, because I'd rather not know I'd rather not be in the room and find it out by traditional reporting, as compared to know something that I then have to sort of go around and verified independently, and then the people who are in the room don't believe you anyway that you verified it independently. Well, the city of Lake Oswego, which those of you who know Oregon is a suburb just south of Portland, has been wrestling with who's a journalist and who to let into their executive session, because there is or are a blogger or two in town who are rather aggressive, and the city fathers and mothers of Lake Oswego are kind of tired of them. But they don't want them in the executive session, and they came to us as the big traditional established media in town and said, "Would you help us define who a journalist is?" And my answer to that was, "No, I'm not going to do that. We have this thing called the First Amendment, and for better or worse, whether it's Westboro Baptist Church or a journalist, the First Amendment is the First Amendment, and I'm not going to try to define that." So in a sense, we're a victim of our own success in that way by having the freest media in the world, and the ability for anybody who wants to be part of this game to join in the game. And I think that's had a really profound effect on where we sit today. It isn't going to change what I do, but the whole point of departure of the conversation, it has brought so many more people into it, and that is having, and I'm not here to say that those of us in mainstream media should be absolved of our role in the decline of traditional media, because we certainly do have a role in it, that has to do with business practices and profit and all manner of other things, that sort of nasty thing that we journalists try to ignore, that we do work for profit-making companies. After 40 years, I'm still trying to ignore it, but not succeeding particularly well. But it has really changed the game and has really contributed to being in this place where we are today.
I've spent a lot of my career overseas and just came back a couple of years ago. And I'm old enough that I remember sitting watching Uncle Walter Cronkite, or Huntley and Brinkley, or the ABC show. And 60 million Americans watch those shows every evening. So we had a shared worldview. I come back looking at how fragmented we are. Dietram, you look at technology. Issues that you study are particularly driven, I think, by this fragmentation of the media. Sure. Has this changed the whole national dialogue? Are we on different pages now?
I think we are to some degree, and I like your question because it also gives me an opportunity to blame somebody who we haven't blamed in the last few hours, and that's the media audience, or us, in that whole thing. And I think one of the things that has, or two of the things that have happened is that we're increasingly not able to deal with disagreement anymore. We're not used to it anymore. And as a result, I think there's a second thing, and that is we don't participate in it all that much anymore. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Part of them technology, part of them other things. I think why are we not used to disagreement anymore? Part of it is just simply the nature of social networks. And I've done a lot of work in that area. Dan Amutz and others have talked for a long time about how we all surround ourselves with people who are exactly like us. We live in communities that look exactly like us. From Madison, Wisconsin, the near west side is white, it's democratic, and people only distinguish each other, or are distinguished from one another by the year that they bought their Prius. That's pretty much it. But so ultimately what that means everybody has the same campaign sign out, and of course I don't have to disagree with my neighbors. And things are not getting better. Things are not getting better in part because of new information environments, I think. Which have really two levels of selectivity built in. And we always talk about the first one, which are, these iGoogle, my Yahoo news aggregator sites that allow us to pre-select information based on ideology, based on even Boolean search terms about what I want to read and minus what I don't want to read. And that's certainly one level, but I think there's a second level that's become much more important, especially recently, and that's a social filter. If you look at Pew data from I think mid last year, 2/3 of people with social networking profiles now report that a lot of their news do come from the feeds that they get in Facebook and everything else. And of course, where do those feeds come from? Those come from very highly selected social networks just around us, of people who work with us, who are exactly like us, and who most likely think exactly like us. And as a result, pre-select the news, in addition to our own ideological filters, on their ideological filters, which are highly consistent. So there's a double distillation kind of process built in, and by the time news reaches. The second thing I think that's really happening, and this comes out of a lot of our research, is the idea that there's a difference between encountering disagreement or incivility and participating it, or participating at least in a discussion that produces it. And the effects are actually quite positive of vehement disagreement and potentially even some lack of civility if we participate in the discussion. So if we did studies and we look at people who frequently participate in discussions with non-like-minded others, people who disagree with them often vehemently. And people who don't participate in these discussions, but of course are also still, or don't speak out in these discussions rather when they do participate in them, then you'll see a positive link for those who do participate, who speak out, who engage on participation, a whole bunch of indicators of citizenship. And you see flatlining for people who don't. And so the comparison is probably a little bit like watching March Madness from your recliner, right? So in other words, you sit there, you don't participate, you see the sport, but it doesn't do anything for you. It's not that your muscles are being worked out or whatever else. Most likely you're getting a little bit obese and it's not really that great for you sitting there with a burger and a beer. But if you actually play the sport, ideally your cognitive muscles get worked out, get a workout, and you end up counter-arguing, you end up building your own cognitive framework, and ideally you inform the discourse surrounding some of these issues. So I think, coming back, I think those are really two important points about the audience, and I think to some degree the segmentation that we're seeing is in part an ideological segmentation, absolutely, but it's also a content segmentation around these specific kind of information sources that we've set up for ourselves. And they get socially amplified or narrowed, whatever the better verb is. And I think that's going to be one of our key challenges as we move ahead with this, and I think where we really have to blame the audience as much as anything else. And their role in this process.
Russ?
I guess I would diagnose the problem differently, and therefore it leads to different solutions. Certainly there's a lot of blame to go around, and no one is innocent in all of this, but your diagnosis of the audience, I think I would disagree with in basic terms. America today is much more tolerant than it was in my parents' generation. This idealization of the 1950s is a golden age, was an age of excessive intolerance, except for people like us here on the panel, white, male, affluent, middle class type. Political interest of the public has actually grown over time. There's been a drop-off in voting, but I think that's a reaction to the dissatisfaction with the way that politicians in elections act. And instead, there's been an invigoration of volunteer activity, direct activity, community activity, because people feel it can make a difference, and they can see the effects, and they can control them. So we're a more tolerant society. We're more interested in politics, and in fact, the negativity towards political parties, the fact that more people are now apartisan, independent of a party than there is Democrats or Republicans, is again a sign that the public itself is dissatisfied with what's going on at the elite level. I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish about the average citizen, but I think if we were to take a pie chart and partial out the blame, I would start at the top and work down rather than start at the bottom and work up. And the other part is, even at the top, I think you made a good point that we have to differentiate between the role that different type of media play in all of this. I think the biggest problem that people see in terms of civility is with the talking heads on television. It isn't that they're complaining so much about what happens in the Oregonian or the newspaper. It's the Glenn Beck versus Fox TV kind of exchanges. And part of the argument one hears from media people in defense of that is it's run by a business model. Again, and therefore you're giving people what they want. But let me give you two kind of counter examples of this. And I don't mean to be flippant or humorous, but to kind of push the counter examples out. look at the conversation and the quality of discourse and civility on a political news channel, and then compare that to what you see on ESPN. On ESPN, there is some yelling, but this is about people talking of a sport where you actually go out and try to knock the head off the other guy. And yet, it's a civil discourse. It's more informative. It's a respect for one another than what you see in politics, where it's symbolic, knocking your head off your opponent on television. Why is it that people turn in great numbers to ESPN to actually learn and to have a reasonable discourse among combatants on the field that act reasonably an adult when they come off the field, and then they turn to CNN and it's predictable talking head versus talking head? The other positive example is, again, not to be flippant, but if I ask students who are disengaged with the media and frustrated with the media, what do they like? Well, the obvious answer is almost always Jon Stewart. Why do they like him? Well, partly he's entertaining, much more entertaining than the nightly news. But it goes deeper than that, that they have a sense that he's honest, that he's real. So if you take the example of Huckabee, you know what Jon Stewart's going to do. He's going to say, well, this is what Huckabee says. This is what the reality is. And he'll do that with both sides. He'll invite both sides on. When he has an interview, I think one of the most perceptive interviews I've seen of Barack Obama was by Jon Stewart, because he didn't ask them about why did you beat the team yesterday, what happened on the field yesterday. He asked them about governance, the role of government, your philosophy of governance. And this is for our kids, right? So here's a business model that seems to be working. Who runs the Restore Sanity rally? Not mainstream media, but Jon Stewart. So what does it say when our statesmen act like comedians and our comedians act like statesmen? That's why I see the problem going from the top down.
But isn't that also this element of entertainment? I mean, Ted, you made a reference to Anderson Cooper before. We run an annual Murrow Symposium where we give a Lifetime Achievement Award to someone deserving of a Lifetime Achievement Award in Murrow's name. And it's getting harder and harder to figure out who that is, trust me. This year it's Ted Koppel, but you get into a point where do students even know who these people are, right? And when we asked the students who should we give it to, Anderson Cooper's name came up. Why? Because he is entertaining. I mean, we can talk about whether or not he's setting up these extreme views so that he can play the holier-than-thou character, but he is entertaining, as is Jon Stewart. I mean, is this what we're doomed to, Ted? That we must be entertaining in order to get information across?
Make a larger point that I wanted to make about one of the difficulties I think we had today in our discussions of civility is that the notion of civility, as we've been developing it and implied in this panel as well, is a model of democracy or an approach to democracy that really doesn't correspond to democracy as it's practiced in the United States. I mean, implied throughout the day is this ideal of deliberation, discourse, debate, and so on. A model of democracy that, one, probably doesn't apply in the United States, certainly doesn't apply to American journalism. American journalism is not grounded in a deliberative notion of democracy. It's rather grounded in a pluralist interest group notion of democracy. It's the idea of competition and conflict, individual choice. I mean, those are the ideals that characterize American journalism, and I would argue American democracy, though I would defer to the earlier panel on that. But certainly with regard to journalism, I think the model is conflict very narrowly defined. And this goes to the point of exclusion and inclusion that I wanted to mention briefly, if I could just develop that. That historically, a market-driven press in the United States, and that has been the dominant model for American journalism going back to at least the 1830s, in the beginning of the penny press, a market-supported press, journalism was exclusive in a very important way. And let me just document two instances or two types of exclusion that violate the norms of civility if the norms of civility are understood in terms of mutual respect. You can't have mutual respect for someone who's not included in the discussion. So here's the point about exclusion. First of all, the American press defines the range of debate in incredibly narrow terms. It's a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right, and anything further in the margins is completely and systematically excluded from the omnibus press, the mainstream press. Now, we do have non-mainstream publications, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the mainstream press is very narrow in the range of views it takes, and very narrow and constricted in the conditions under which they will accommodate that debate. So there have been a number of interesting studies that document, I think, in very compelling ways, the fact that the press does not do a good job creating the conditions for debate unless that debate exists independent of the newsroom and they can what's called index it, which is to say make reference to it. So if the Democrats and the Republicans are debating something, the press can amplify that debate. But if the Republicans and Democrats are not debating something, when we need a free press the most to instigate debate, the press is gone. Right? They can't do that. To do that, right, is to risk the charge of bias. To do that is to risk the charge, and this is an insulting thing to say to a journalist, you have an agenda. Right? Well, if you wait for the agenda to be set for you by mainstream politicians, you're going to end up with a very, very narrow debate. And what gets systematically excluded from that debate are independent voices, voices that are beyond the mainstream, but especially the voices of subordinated groups in society are the ones that never get to participate in the debate. And here I'm talking about the ideal of a multicultural society that recognizes the social inequalities, the inequalities that have existed historically, and understand knowledge in society in terms of differences in social experiences, differences in social groups, and ultimately differences in social perspectives. In terms of accommodating those differences in social perspectives, the press historically has not done a very good job. What compounds this, and this is the second example or the other side of the same coin, what compounds that in American journalism is the particular view of professionalism in journalism. Professionalism has a homogenizing effect on the practice and construction of news. Professionalism means standardization, right? When you take the idea of professionalism and apply it to the traditional professions, you can understand the logic of standardization. We want to assume, for example, that the physician licensed to practice in Kansas is going to operate under the same set of conditions as the surgeon in Florida, for example. That the standards of cleanliness in an operating room, that both surgeons went to med school, both surgeons are recognized by a state medical exam, whatever the standardization might be. Standardization in journalism has very different consequences, in part because we expect journalism to be diverse. And journalism has had a very difficult time reconciling the demands of professionalism with the quest for diversity. So if you look at, and Peter's very familiar with the struggle to diversify American newsrooms, which goes back to the Kerner Commission report in the 1960s when the press was finally confronted by a federal report about being entirely white and entirely male. And the press was asked institutionally, what are you going to do about that? And the American Society of Newspaper Editors said categorically, we're going to do something about it. And over a period of time, I think their initial report came out in the late 1970s, they said they were going to diversify newsrooms. Their goal was the year 2000. And by diversifying newsrooms, they meant roughly a correspondence between the diversity in the newsroom and the diversity in the community being served. In the crudest of terms, but a very worthwhile goal. The year 2000 came along and they weren't there. They weren't even close to being there. So they pushed it back to 2025. And we'll have to come back and revisit that. But here's the paradox and here's the problem. Even when you diversify newsrooms, you bring in different kinds of people with different social experiences, different social perspectives, you in effect tell them, though never explicitly, but professionalism tells them that they need to bracket those differences. those differences need to be put aside because there is a right way to practice journalism. So I don't care if it's you or you, if you're covering the city council, I expect you to come back with basically the same story. Now, if we're going to do that, if the demands of professionalism are going to say, in effect, there is a right way to do journalism, and if you're a professional, you'll understand that, and if in fact, the socialization process in the newsroom takes care of that, then it really doesn't matter if you diversify the newsroom. You're not going to be diversifying news. And I think that is a problem that the American press hasn't yet confronted. I think the new digital landscape creates new opportunities to diversify journalism, but it still puts a particular burden on the mainstream press of the kind that Peter manages, because it's still the mainstream press that cuts across the various communities in a geographic area or even regionally and nationally. And I think one of the big challenges for the mainstream press going forward, and I'd like to get Peter's reaction to this, is monitoring what we were referring to in the last session as various enclaves, monitoring them and amplifying voices that don't ordinarily get into the press. So to take the example of my hometown area, the Bay Area in San Francisco, when I look at the San Francisco Chronicle and I look at the San Jose Mercury News, I see virtually no attention whatsoever to the issues being debated in the minority press. Instead, they will translate those issues into the kind of conflict coverage, but that conflict coverage doesn't capture the sense of injustice that permeates the narrative as that narrative appears in the ethnic press. For example, that there are no, what Iris Marion Young calls, there are no linkages in journalism between this kind of press and that kind of press. And that's an institutional challenge. And it's an institutional challenge that no one newsroom can solve. But it reminds us, and this goes back to Peter's point about not having a monolithic view of journalism, but recognizing the loose confederation of institutions that comprise American journalism. It's important that we think not only about the independence of each newsroom, but about the relationship between newsrooms, so that one newsroom is in a position to amplify the debates that take place in another newsroom, so that you're not simply, going back to what you're saying, you're not simply reading and rereading debates that you're familiar with and agree with.
I know you want to make a point, Dietram. Let me just ask Peter a question. That's basically he said, she said journalism. This issue of we go in, we're objective, we're balanced. He said this, the Republicans said this, the Democrats said that. You just dealt with a very inflammatory story, the Christmas bombing, the would-be Christmas bombing in Portland. Those of you who are not familiar, a Muslim student at University of Oregon or Oregon State?
He took classes
at
Oregon
all right.
State, yeah.
A student, a failed bombing attempt at the lighting of the Christmas tree. The kind of story that brings out extreme noise on both sides. How did you get beyond that? Just he's saying he's a bad guy because he's a Muslim, he's saying he's a good guy because whatever. Yeah, and I would begin by saying I sure embrace and agree with everything that Ted just said. In fact, if he'd said that to me 25 years ago, I would have had my personal philosophy formed a lot more firmly and quickly, and perhaps been able to act even more effectively on it than I have been, because those are issues I've been working on my entire career. I mean, I think that story is a superb example of this. And I think it's amplified in this era that we live in. Later, perhaps I can amplify a little on what Ted just said and put it in the context of today's world because of the internet and all that brings to bear. I gave up on the concept of objectivity a long time ago, which still gets raised eyebrows at sessions of the Society of Professional Journalists or whatever the case might be. And I prefer to talk a lot more about truth-telling, because I have yet to encounter an objective human being. And we're all products of where we grew up, where we were educated, our parents, our families, our socioeconomic status, whatever the case might be. That's just the nature of human beings. And when we're dealing with stories like this, what matters to me is trying to get to the truth of whatever the case might be. I can't tell you
for example. Just to use a silly example, since you brought up Huckabee, which I was reading one of the truth-telling services that are all over the place now. In fact, we run PolitiFact Oregon out of our newsroom, which does those sorts of things on politicians in our part of the world. I still take calls from birthers saying, "Why aren't you telling the truth about Obama and the fact that he's not an American citizen," and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter how many times I say factcheck.org to them on the phone. They're still going, because that's where Obama's birth certificate was put up on the web during the campaign. Those sorts of things are still going to go on, and people are going to believe what they want to believe. And we have to do what we can do to tell whatever the truth may be. This particular case was very difficult because I'm not remembering the young man's full name off the top of my head, but one of his names, I think his last name is Muhammad. So the young man who was arrested in the sting, if you will, on the plot to bomb Pioneer Courthouse Square in Portland. We approached it from multiple points of view, trying to get at what was the truth of the situation. Yes, there's sort of always a master narrative, to pick up on what Ted was talking about, that we have to wrestle against. And yes, we know we're going to get pilloried in certain corners by even raising things that needed to be raised in the context of that case. How does a kid from suburban Portland, he lived and his family lived in one of the more affluent school districts, if you know Portland at all, out in Beaverton. How does a kid like this get radicalized? That's one narrative of the story. Another narrative is, did the FBI entrap him? And I happen to live in a place where the ACLU is revered to a large degree as compared to hated as in other parts of the country. And so we did a lot of reporting discussing entrapment and how does this fit into it, and had people, in this case, on both sides of the argument, because we're not qualified ultimately to make that call, but certainly had a full discussion to bring people into that question in the way that the FBI sort of guided him through the process, and then when he was going to set off the bomb, which was a fake, then arrested him and so on and so forth. My point isn't to defend his actions or the FBI's actions. My point is that in trying to make sense of all that and the complexities of today's society and the polarizing elements that come rolling in on us from every angle, every place. I mean, I've literally had, and this is a true story. One day I'm sitting at my desk doing my business and the phone rings, and I perhaps foolishly believe in taking calls from readers. And I answer the phone, and it's somebody who's half yelling at me, saying, this is several years ago now, "Why aren't you telling the truth about the great work that the Bush administration is doing in Iraq? You guys are obviously a bunch of left-wing communists. You're not supporting our war effort there. I'm disgusted with you." And the conversation goes nowhere from there, of course, but ends, and the phone rings again, and I answer it again, and this time it's somebody from the polar political opposite, saying, "You right-wing fascists, you're supporting the Bush administration efforts in Iraq. Why aren't you telling the truth? We're killing innocent civilians over there," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why, and these were not fools. These were not people who couldn't form a sentence. These were perfectly intelligent people and readers of our newspaper and of our website and so on and so forth. It's just illustrative of the complexity of it. Now, I think where I happen to live, this is more acute perhaps than some other places. I don't think I would have gotten the second call if I was the editor of the Oklahoman, for example, in Oklahoma City. But in Portland and in the Northwest, certainly that can be a more common phenomenon. So it's just an incredibly complex equation. And I would say there wasn't a heck of a lot of civility in either one of those calls.
Dietram, you look at things like stem cell, which brings out that same kind of problem.
Sure. Yeah. No, in many ways it does, and in many ways it plays on or it falls into the same trap. The coverage of issues like stem cell research certainly falls into the same trap that Ted talked about, and Peter to some degree as well, having to fit things into dominant narratives that may pre-exist and may have for a long time. As a European, I always look at the U.S. in a still amused way. I've lived here for 15 years now, but there's still this artificial dichotomy to almost every single issue, right? And that is to some degree mirrors the political system, which certainly, I grew up in Germany, and I'm a citizen of Germany, so for me, a two-party system has never really existed, at least not since I've been alive. And I think there's an element to that two-party system that exacerbates that problem in many ways. And earlier during the day, I can't remember which session, we had a question about, so what do we have to tweak about the system to make it more deliberative and maybe less combative? And one of the things that a lot of people have talked about is McGovern-Fraser in 1968, after the 1968 election. So the change and the shift toward a caucus and primary system. That folks like Tom Patterson at the Kennedy School, for instance, have argued has really given the media more power than they can handle. No offense, and so what he's saying is, look, what we've created, or he may not be saying this directly, so I'm gonna expand on what he's saying, is that we've created this idea of giving the media the role to narrow down options which before that parties have narrowed down. And to narrow down these options for us. In elections, that means building momentum. That means essentially being part in that cycle of media coverage, poll results, and raising money. So, right, the more money I raise, the better my polls I'm going to do in the polls. The better I do in the polls, the more media coverage I get. The more money I raise, the better I do in media coverage, and so on. So in other words, media become a key player in narrowing down the options, which again, as somebody who's not American and doesn't understand baseball, I'm going to use the analogy anyway, which seems to be fairly similar to playoffs. American League, National League, right? You battle it out on each side, and then whoever's left standing at the end gets to duke it out. Which seems to be very similar to American politics, and media really having, since at least I guess the 72 election, having played a key role in narrowing down those options. Coming back to your question on stem cells, I think that's exactly where some of that party grit comes from, that for issues like stem cells, of course, are tremendously important. That is, of course, something for when a lot of my work deals with emerging technologies and the increasing complexity, nanotech being one of them, a technology where we have 1,200 consumer products on the market, nobody knows what it is, and there's absolutely no regulatory system in place. And nobody in the media talks about it because it's too complex. How do you explain something like this? And the answer is, well, you explain it very often by attaching it to, and again, either a schema that we have in our heads or that work for us, and the partisan one being a great one. So for stem cell, I think it just lends itself, reducing the complexity of an issue. There's actually been a great study by a colleague of mine at Wisconsin, Dominique Broussard, and a former student of mine who's now an American, Matt Nisbet, who looked at how diverse the set of narratives was for stem cell research early on in the 70s when it came out, everything from umbilical cord to adult stem cells to everything else. And how it over time became narrower and narrower and narrower, and all the frames dropped out. And essentially now we're talking about it's killing babies or not. So it really comes down to that very clear partisan religious set of frames that why do they work so well? Because they allow us to attach an issue that's just way too complex to comprehend, and I'm being simplistic, obviously, to an interpretive schema that we have easily available, and that media, for a whole variety of reasons, share and really have bought into. So I think that there's that interplay that's really not helping. Maybe one last really quick comment, because it answers that question that came up earlier, what do we have to change? Part of what a lot of people have argued is that we really need to significantly change electoral cycles. That the idea that for 2 years we talk about, we're leading up with 2 years of coverage, what else can you put in there other than that horse race game schema, who's ahead, who's behind, who's winning, who's losing, and fitting that into that dichotomy that people find interesting, but that may not necessarily increase their engagement in politics. So that certainly has been one suggestion along the way.
So where do we go from here? I want to throw it to the audience in a minute, but you have this plethora of fragmented citizen journalism and variations on politicized journalism, democratization of the media, some would say. The other end, you have the corporatization of the media. You have channels like Fox that have become virtual political parties with an array of potential Republican candidates on their roster, two of whom just went off on leave the other day. I mean, where do we go? I mean, is this just an evolution that we are doomed to go through? Are there concrete steps? Ted, you mentioned before the idea of government getting involved at some point. My area of expertise happens to be Middle East media, and so, I immediately cringe at this idea of government involvement in media because, clearly that hasn't worked very well over there. But at the same token, we have National Public Radio and Network under our college, so there is an element of government. But what's the next step? I mean, Ted, why don't you start?
Just try to take a stab at that. Although we have a marketplace-oriented approach to journalism in the United States, and as I suggested, for a good 150 years, it is not a press without state subsidies. All right, so this notion that there is no role for the state is a misnomer, and it's part of the American mythology about what an American press means.
And by the way, the people up in the back who are taping this are partly subsidized by the government, Corporation for Public Broadcasting grants.
Yeah. But there are many other. I mean, the second-class mailing permit is a good example. What's even a better example are the newspapers, the smaller newspapers in particular, that depend heavily on legal notices. The California Newspaper Publishers Association campaigned aggressively against legislation that would allow cities to post their legal notices on their city website, right? And they tried to frame the argument as in the public interest, but it was obviously in the self-interest of publishers, and I can't fault them for wanting to maintain that kind of advertising revenue. But what you're going to see, and what you're beginning to see now, are a handful of the larger newspapers figuring out a way to capitalize on those legal notices in a way that's going to undermine the tradition of using those legal notices to support the local community press. Believe it or not, the Wall Street Journal recently ran a legal notice itself in the papers in the Bay Area announcing that they're applying for general circulation status in Santa Clara County, which is a legal argument they need to make, which is to say they reach X number of people and they can be considered a newspaper of general circulation. If they win that fight, they can then bid for legal notices in Santa Clara County, which includes San Jose and Palo Alto and many other communities. Rupert Murdoch is in a position where he's going to, I'm betting on this, I don't know this for sure, but he's going to try that around the country if he's smart, eating up those, which provides an advertising base for the Wall Street Journal that they never had before. But I think there are all sorts of interesting and positive roles for the state, as I said, in creating a press, in creating a system of journalism that we want, that the marketplace itself is not going to provide. Let me just give one example that I think is relevant to those of you in the field of libraries, which I think is another vitally important community institution. You remember reading a couple of weeks ago about Apple figuring out a way to charge in a very convenient way for daily newspaper subscriptions, in particularly response to Rupert Murdoch's new online newspaper. I mean, one of the great barriers in making newspapers digital was figuring out a painless, unobtrusive way of reminding people that they need to pay for this thing. And Apple apparently has come up with a plan, a technology, a software that they think will ease the pain, more in the spirit of iTunes. You just don't pay attention, and it shows up in your email inbox in a couple of weeks. What's 99 cents here, 99 cents there? Well, it adds up. But there are a number of people in the industry that are confident that they can make that work. Here's the opportunity I see for libraries. And the question that I know librarians have asked themselves, and librarians are always struggling with a finite budget and an endless demand for material, whether the material are, what newspapers can we afford to subscribe to, what books do we want in our collection? I mean, university libraries struggle with the same thing. The parallel question here is, what does it mean to subscribe to a newspaper on behalf of the community? What does it mean to subscribe to a newspaper on behalf of the industry? I think we're getting very close to the point where economically and politically, someone's going to be able to make the argument, I'm not quite prepared to make it yet, but someone's going to be prepared to make the argument that libraries have an obligation to subscribe to certain publications on behalf of the community, which is to say, giving everyone free access to the newspaper online in exchange for a bulk subscription. That's reasonably priced so libraries don't go out of business, although this is going to require an additional allocation from the city council, but it accomplishes two things. One, it overcomes the lack of access to some digital landscapes, the digital divide that is still very real in the United States, and it provides a subsidy for newspapers that we want to continue to exist that won't be able to exist without those bulk subscriptions. Now, I don't know where that kind of question is going to lead us, but I would certainly hope that the people in the area of libraries will take the question seriously to the point where they decide to accept it or reject it. But I'd be very curious to get their reaction to a model like that.
Russ, wither journalism, wither us.
Well, I've been really interested in comments the other panelists have made. And let me say that one of the reactions I have is how important it is to differentiate between different parts of the media. When Ted talked about journalistic norms and you talked about the Oregonian, that didn't sound like the norms that I see Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Oberman, or even Rachel Maddow exercising. And so we have...
What is a journalist, right? That
Yes.
gets back to that question.
And most of these others aren't journalists. But where do people get most of their news about national political issues? It's not from newspapers. It's this kind of decaying readership. And if you look at our students here, probably at Washington State, like most other universities, if you look at them, you know, the last broadsheet is going to be printed before 2025 because they don't read newspapers anymore. The real interesting question is this dynamic between television and the internet. I mean, the latest Pew survey is saying that young people now, for the first time in Pew's polling, use the internet as a primary means of information. Television comes second, and way down on the list is newspapers. So the dynamic of these new media are really going to be an interesting part in the interaction between television and internet. To what extent does that create more homogeneous networks of who you get your feeds from? So I think this is a time of a great deal of change for the media, and one only wishes that the journalistic norms were extending to these other new media. The last thing I would say in response to Dietram's example is, again, I think it's too easy, and this maybe builds on something that Ted had said, that the media amplifies and is adversarial. It I think creates a false dichotomy for many of us, that it's either unlimited this or none of this. And if you look at the American public, on most issues, like your colleague Mo Fiorina has argued very persuasively, the median American is looking for half of this and half of that. And what they're getting is all of one or all of the other, and they want something that is more reasonable in the middle. And the difficulty is maybe because they're adversarial and they amplify, the media presents false dichotomies and people are frustrated. You know, they don't want the Republican budget cuts any more than they want the budget cuts that the Democrats alone would do. What they want is something reasonable in the middle that deals with things as adults would deal with them. You know, I think it's that frustration that they have of one party or the other, or black or white, and they see the world as shades of gray.
Dietram?
Just expanding on that point about interaction between new and traditional media, because I do think that's a very important one. I think what we are seeing and will increasingly see is that mixture of discourse meets media, right? So, I mean, I think that the traditional mass communicated message is dead. It's over. Even a newspaper article I don't read in the morning on a piece of paper and at the breakfast table by myself. I read an article that already has a bunch of blocks ahead of it that says how often it's been shared on Facebook, how often it's been retweeted, and that's followed by a whole bunch of discussion items below that really socially contextualize that for me. I just bought myself a Google television, even better. You watch TV in a picture-in-picture, and around it you have a variety of information sources and additional information that you real-time search for yourself, and it all gets embedded into one big thing. Why does it matter? We just did a large-scale knowledge network survey, about 3,500 people, which we split into 4 representative national surveys. And then we gave them each the same fake blog post. And then we followed that blog post up with discussions that were manipulated, not based on content, but simply based on the level of civility. And then also the level of agreement and disagreement. What is most fascinating about this is not that disagreement makes a difference in terms of how you look at the discussion. What's most fascinating is that across these national samples, you see a difference in what people take away from the article, which was exactly the same article across 4 conditions. They recall different things and have different views on their likelihood of being able to impact that particular area, simply based on the follow-up discussions that they've read among fake citizens. So it's a really very weak manipulation in many ways, yet it influences what kind of information we take away. So I think those, and that's just, I think, scratching the surface of exactly those interactions and how they're going to play out. Information will no longer come by itself. It will come socially embedded in a real-time scenario with tremendous effects on how that discourse shapes how we make sense of that information later on.
Peter, fake news, fake citizens.
Interesting.
Is that the future?
No, hopefully not. But the complexity of these times is, and the amount of change that we've seen in media over the last decade is remarkable to me. I mean, even an ink-stained wretch like myself, I have a Facebook page. I'm on Twitter. Actually, I really got on Facebook to make sure my children weren't doing anything too crazy, but it's advanced beyond that. I understand the concept of search engine optimization, social media optimization, things like that. Those are a part of my world now. I got into journalism for the reason everybody gets into journalism, because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something that had profound social good to it. And I'm glad to be part of a place where that still goes on. On the front page of our newspaper this morning and on our website, we had 3 investigative stories from a variety of different angles that told people where we live some very important information about the conduct of their government and other issues that have importance to where people live. And I think that's going to endure and must endure for a good long time, even with the inherent weaknesses that have been well discussed here, because those weaknesses have been around certainly for the 40 years I've been involved in this and trying to work against those weaknesses. What's happening now, though, is so you know, it's I mean, I grew up in the Star Trek generation, so I tend to use the phrase "moving at warp speed" quite a lot, but it's also kind of a situation where resistance is futile. We have to jump with both feet into this new world, and for those of us who do what I do and what my colleagues and I do, somebody used the term curation earlier. I don't really like that word, because I think that should be reserved for people who work in art museums, who do a much higher intellectual level of work than we do necessarily in a newsroom. But that's a lot of what we're doing now. For example, a fundamental part of my work and my colleagues' work now is serving as a gathering place for news from throughout our community. We've built a system of, one of the terms of art now in newspaper journalism at least, is hyperlocal journalism, which is a very fancy term for what community papers have done forever, but on a much finer level. And one of the priorities in my newsroom is being the center of hyperlocal journalism for metropolitan Portland. So we have 22 hyperlocal pages set up on our website now, where we are driving that community conversation, trying to get at the issues that matter to people and bringing the community into that conversation. It isn't, you know, part of it is still very much the journalism done by our staff, but again, that contemporary definition of journalism is so much broader today, and people have points of view that need to be there. And the conversation that ensues is often quite rigorous and quite substantial as compared to some of the typical commentary that goes on websites that you know, just kind of makes you sick on some level, which really fits into this whole conversation about civility. We had a story this morning about some questionable spending by the University of Oregon's football program. And the fact that we even raised that question, you can imagine what the comments were like. Now, granted, it's sports, so as much as I love ESPN and agree that, I mean, ESPN's where I go to find a respite from all the noise, that's for sure.
But Olbermann did come from there.
Yes, he did.
Mustache.
He was a lot funnier, I think, when he was on ESPN myself, but that's just my view. So dealing with all this, again, the complexity is immense. The layers of it are infinite. And we're in this sort of wonderful but crazy transition from the way it was when I came into the business in the 70s to the way it's going to be in 2025 or whatever it is, because nobody is quite sure where it's going to be. But for those of us who are practitioners of it and have some influence in that place, I'm very interested in expanding the definition of journalism, still doing the kind of journalism that we value and that we want to have impact, but that creates an opportunity for these conversations to take place in a much more unfiltered way, in a much more genuine way, and hopefully that gets beyond those sort of narrow narratives, whether it's on stem cells. You know, I mean, this is at a much more community-based level. It's really more about the quality of education in neighborhood schools, for example, than about major national policy issues. And I hope we can drive it in a direction where the conversation is really useful, and is a kind of journalism that we haven't really seen before, and that expands the definition of journalism in a positive way.
Cornell, do we have time for a couple of questions? Sure, we've got about 15 minutes. Okay, all right. Anyone have any questions, or have we answered all the issues?
Solved all problems.
Sir, I can't see the line with the lights, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Marcia Franklin, and for more than...
there we go. You are there.
I'm Marcia, and for more than 20 years I've been a producer and host at Idaho Public Television. And I just want to give a brass tacks example of...
Oh, you're one of those government subsidized
There you
journalists,
go. Partially government subsidized. We appreciate your support, too. But we work really hard to have civil discussions on public television, so much so that, you know, there's the old joke that PBS stands for pretty boring stuff. But people really look to us for that. And I want to tell you that for the past 10 to 12 years, the experience I've had is that when I call people on different sides of an issue, they don't want to sit with each other. I make the attempt, and I make a big attempt to call different types of people. No, I won't sit with him or her because that lends credence to their point of view. I won't be with them. Or, we're in the middle of litigation. I don't want to talk about it. That's a very common thing. And I'm not just talking about interest groups. What disturbs me probably the most is that we have our public agencies that are doing this. So we'll have the Transportation Department that doesn't want to sit with its opponents on the Highway 12 issue, or the Fish and Game Department that doesn't want to sit with the wolf proponents, or the U.S. Air Force that doesn't want to sit with the people that oppose the expansion of the training range. And as a producer, it puts me in a dilemma, because, you know, ultimately, maybe I'll just take one side, show one side, and then a week later have the other side. But is that really a very interesting program? So what ends up happening as a moderator is I have to end up taking the other point of view if I go ahead with a program with one side, and then people point fingers at me as, oh, you're, you know, biased or whatever. So I'm just saying, from a brass tacks perspective, television's different than print. Print, you can call somebody up and get an opinion, then you can call somebody else up. They don't have to sit next to each other, right? So they can do it over the telephone. And so it's been...
But obviously you can put them on tape individually.
Well, actually, it's really difficult for us and with our budgets to go out and do that. I eventually did do that with the U.S. Air Force. I got so frustrated that I went down to Mountain Home Air Force Base and taped, you know, a colonel, put him on tape, and rolled him into the show. But it wasn't the same as having him there live. My pitch has always been, hey, if you're on live, you can't be edited. It's great, you know. It's not like print where you could be misquoted. Now we're seeing this in...
Unless you're on Bill O'Reilly's show.
Right. Now we're seeing this with a documentary I'm working on, where especially people who've seen the way certain documentaries have been skewed, they don't want to be part of a documentary because they could be edited improperly. So I'm just saying, I do think that there are journalists, particularly in television, who make an attempt to try to have civil discussions, and they're thwarted by that. Two other quick points. You asked about solutions. Especially in commercial journalism, television journalism, I don't know about print. entering journalists are woefully underpaid. I mean, shockingly underpaid, as are videographers who are increasingly being asked to cover the news just with a camera. And I think until we value our broadcast journalists more and pay them what they're worth, you're going to get people who are rushed, people who are young, people who are inexperienced, people who don't have managing editors anymore because that's been cut out of the budget. Nobody's looking over them, and you're going to get the news that you pay for, or whatever. So I really feel strongly about that. And then secondly, I'd put a pitch in for national issues forums. I don't know how many of you have been involved in that, but that's a really neat nexus between libraries and I, as a moderator for television, was involved with that. And that's where groups of people are convened, they vote on an issue, then they study about it, then they re-vote. And as a moderator and being involved in those, they're fascinating. And it's a great civil discussion to have, and I'm a big believer in libraries being the next place where we need to go to have some of these discussions. So just from my point of view, I want to let you know how hard it is sometimes to have these discussions as much as you want to try. People resist them from their end.
Just two quick responses. One, I think you're absolutely right about the pay scale for journalists. I mean, it's just criminal, and it's getting worse, in part because so many private companies have found ways of in effect, hiring reporters for free. They're so eager to get clips. We have a hard time finding any paid internships anymore, especially in the area of broadcasting. Not only will they not pay, they demand the students take it for credit, which in effect requires them to pay for the privilege of working for nothing.
I also heard one of the major magazines in New York, I think you know about this, was actually auctioning off its internships.
I mean, it's awful. And the other point you made, I think, which is sad and funny at the same time, is this idea that if there's litigation pending, I can't talk. I mean, that's just crap. That's just an entirely self-serving argument that the company's lawyer said, don't talk because it's going to make my case more difficult to make. I mean, I would prefer that journalists never, ever cite that as a reason for declining comment. And that would just send a clear message to people. Those are not legitimate grounds for not commenting.
Well, I talk about a live TV show. If I can't get them right here.
Yeah. Right. All you can say on air is they won't comment, but don't say because litigation is pending. Right.
Yeah, I was wondering. My name is Ayad Rahmani. I'm part of the art and architecture panel. I was wondering to what extent you think media plays a compensatory role for the lack of real access to real debates in the public. Because we live in a society of codes and laws, there's not a whole lot to talk about that is going to actually find effect. And I wonder to what extent media comes in to play a kind of a controlling valve, or a valve that allows us sort of access to our emotions, and whether that's why blogs have flourished in a big way, sort of this plethora of opinions going all over the place.
Russ, one of the things you study is public meetings.
Well, let me first begin by saying, for me, the most interesting part from the preceding question was the comment that you had, the third comment you had about discussions that you do on NPR and the bringing citizens together. There seems to be a real desire for people to have voice, which we shouldn't find surprising. Blogs always were an amazing thing to me because we know that the vast majority of blogs are never read, except by the person that writes them. And then, even then, you wonder if they read what they wrote. Or maybe they just can't spell, right? But it reflects this fact that people are interested in politics. They want to have voice, and the evolution of that is maybe it's to have voice through the media. I mean, I'm always amazed at what motivates people to write op-ed pieces. It seems more a feeling of self-expression than of any kind of instrumental influence in politics. But again, what is happening is we're in a very dynamic world. Blogs were the hot thing, what, 3-4 years ago? Now blogs are fading away. And why are they fading away is because of social media. And that's advantageous. Why? Because you get to interact with other human beings rather than be a voice in the desert where no one hears you, or the tree that falls in the forest and no one hears you. And I think it again reflects this desire of people to speak. Now, the other puzzling thing in all of this is that the people who make comments on your news articles are probably the people at the two extremes of the continuum.
No, they were fake. We faked them.
No, I mean his. Oh, you faked his.
Fake too.
Yeah.
To some degree, yeah.
It's a field experiment.
Exactly. So if I make a juxtaposition between the two questions, one of my worries about social networking or the comments that are following newspaper articles is there you have the potential for a real loss of civility, especially in the newspaper articles, because it's anonymous. And if you put people together in a room and ask them to discuss with one another, more often than not, I leave amazed by or pleasantly surprised by how civil and reasonable people are. If you put them online now, and they're making comments and they're doing it anonymously, and you have this extremism and no ability of kind of sanctioning and social moderation, that there's a possibility with this new media that it makes matters much worse. But this goes back to the point earlier that we live in this very dynamic period. People want to have voice, but how we give them voice and the forum that we have voice has potential consequences, either positive or negative. We have choices, and which choice we follow is now what the question is. Dietram probably say, yeah.
One very pessimistic aspect to that answer, and that is in part responding to the idea of choices. And there's a very interesting study that Diana Mutz did at some point, I think she was out at Stanford actually, where she gave people more civil and less civil versions of the same discussion, and manipulated that in terms of how the verbal expressions were taking place and how close up the camera shots were. And what she found is that people really liked the less civil versions much more, were much more excited about them in terms of likelihood of watching them down the road. But the outcomes, when you measured outcomes like how efficacious they felt afterwards, or how participatory they wanted to be, they had really detrimental effects at the same time. The second kind of depressing note to this is during my sabbatical last semester, I had an opportunity to write a white paper for the Kennedy School, in which I looked at how often these public meetings, who actually goes to these public meetings, which is about 3 to 5% of the population at best, depending on which poll you look at. If it's online, it's an online forum, maybe it's a little bit higher, but not much. But more importantly, and this is the second question, we also looked at how much newspapers cover them and amplify what's happening, right? So you have an impact through these meetings in part because you speak, but in part because it's covered in the local paper. And we looked at different size classes of newspapers from large to small and across ownership structures, and the numbers are depressingly low on average. There's a few dozen, maybe a year stories in any of these on average, maybe 2 dozen max, that cover public meetings. So not only don't people want to go there, but when they do go, they don't really get amplified in the public discourse through mass media. So. And those might be those 2 dozen stories right there. Yeah.
Sir.
I'm Bill Eichner, I'm director of the Orcas Island Public Library. And I have to confess up front, I haven't had TV reception on that island for about 6.5 years, so my news is on the internet or a clip of Jon Stewart or something like that. So that gives me, and as a librarian, it gives me a really interesting perspective on the mainstream electronic media, which I think makes this panel, in a sense, the most important for this whole idea of civility, because most of us get our ideas of civility and democracy from mainstream media, or the internet, of course, and to some degree, newspapers and so on, and magazines. My conviction about mainstream, the hot media, the electronic media, is that it does breed passivity and gullibility among people, and it's almost like a correlation. I haven't done a study of this, but I think the more people tend to watch TV, the less they really think. And I think Professor Carter last night talked about that whole idea of spending an hour doing nothing, and that's a challenge for all of us. There's dozens of things that occur to me having heard your conversation, and I think just a few bullet points, I think, is one, there is a very narrow range when you look at the mainstream news media. In fact, publishing in general, a very narrow range of discussion. This artificial dichotomy, left wing, right wing, and really the spectrum is much wider and much deeper than that. It's an artificial dichotomy, I think, that we have to get past, and I think that's part of our challenge as librarians, to look at all the range of output, publishing output, books, magazines, online, website. We try to develop our website, and the whole idea of a community forum. We have the whole range of things we're trying. Part of our own strategic plan is to have a community forum for ideas, and it is that hyper-local idea in a sense. We're trying to have formal lectures, we have informal discussions, we have online and all kinds of range of discussion. So I'm fascinated to hear you talk about that, and I think that's worth really following up. And I think the other point that occurs to me is, in political discussion, it's left and right to me is, again, an artificial one. I think to me it's more like the haves and the have-nots. And as public libraries, I'm sure in every public library I've worked in, there are the so-called great unwashed masses that use the library and need the library. There are many that support us, and we're grateful for that have a lot of money and give us money because they believe in the mission of the library. But I think it's in a sense, from my biased perspective, it's the last bastion of democracy in a lot of ways. The public library, to some degree, university libraries, but we're the ones that people walk right in, and they don't have to have a membership card. They get one if they live there. They use it. So it's really a responsibility for us to develop that whole voice for the 80% of the people that have, you've all seen the graphs of the 1% have 40% of the wealth. That to me is the real challenge. That's the real distressing thing, and that's the real crucial thing I think we're facing right now. And it's not really a question, but I'd invite some comments on that.
Oops, can I just say, we'll take the last two questions up there so nobody else go up. It's getting kind of late. Anybody want to say anything on that? No? Next question?
Yeah, well, they have to adjust the microphone
Okay.
for me. I'm Gene Rosa. I'm an affiliate professor in the Foley Institute. My question is prompted by Ted's observations, but I think others may want to respond to. And in particular, the description you made of the institutional homogenization of diversity within the media structure because of professionalization. And I have a general question about that, and then it's two parts that leads to a different question. And the first question is, do you think that travels? Now, my context is the university, and I think it applies exactly to the university. The attempts, so within the disciplines, because you have to meet certain standards and professional judgments and so forth, there's an inherent homogenization process that goes on there. In addition, that, as you know, in the 60s, we tried to correct that by creating these diverse departments, but they've been the first to go in budget cuts. If there are more institutions like that, then this would suggest that it's not what you described as an institutional problem, it's a meta-institutional problem, perhaps something deeper in our culture about what we value, and to the extent that it may be socially desirable to talk about diversity, but in fact, in reality, what we want is replicates of ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the point I was making about diversity in newsrooms could and has been made about diversities in universities, school districts. I think we face the exact same challenge at Stanford, where we take great pride in the diversity of our undergraduate student body, that the same challenge that newsrooms face when they try to diversify themselves. I mean, a cynical view is diversity ends up being a little more than a photo opportunity. And often it's just that. But I think there are people taking it very seriously. But here's what I think is the problem, and this relates to the second point you're making. The pluralist notion of democracy that I think informs American journalism is based on a fundamentally essentialist view of culture. Culture is reduced to identity politics of the ugliest kind, such that social and cultural differences are correlated with people independent of their social position and social perspective. But if you understand culture in a more relational way, and you tie it to social position and social perspective, not the fact that somebody happens to be a particular gender or of a particular race, which is to say, let's not argue that race causes social perspective or social position, but rather social position and social perspective brings about a different way of knowing the world. That's the kind of diversity we want. Genuine cultural diversity, not simply a newsroom or a classroom full of different looking people, but people who have different perspectives, different positions, and different ways of experiencing the world. That's much more difficult, and I think that's the challenge we face.
In fact, just a very quick thought on that point. The homogenization, or whatever, if that's a word, that goes on in news organizations, and the whole point on diversity isn't just one around ethnicity and gender. It's on background, that is where people come from. It's on, our sports editor in our newsroom is from Mississippi. And every time there's a national story about Oregon's turning into Mississippi because of the quality of falling quality of our test scores, or whatever the case might be, our sports editor, he's a really good guy. He doesn't take offense to it. He laughs about it. But it is offensive on some level, because the homogenizing quality of the newsroom is regional, as well as being related to the color of one's skin or their gender. It's about who becomes a journalist, because we didn't get into journalism to become wealthy, that's for sure. We got into journalism because we had a cause at heart. It was a calling for all of us. That has a homogenizing effect in some places. When you live in the Northwest, there's this thing called, although I think it's overstated, but there's this thing called Northwest nice. We treat each other nicely in our face-to-face interaction. If somebody ever ran by my office screaming, I'd be utterly shocked, and it would be like the old National Geographic specials where the ostrich heads, pop up and start looking around, because everybody would be stunned by that. Now, when I worked in San Francisco, it was very different. People were throwing things at each other, but in the Northwest, that kind of thing just doesn't happen. Plus, journalists, in general, at the risk of a horrible stereotype, tend to be more introverted than extroverted. So people who are loud and funny and cut a wide swath in the newsroom are quickly typecast as being odd or different.
And you are talking about print journalists, I have to add.
Yeah, I'm talking about my world. Yes, I'm talking very much so. I'm talking about my world. And as a result, those people who are a little different conform. And that happens if people are of color, if they're from Mississippi, whatever the case might be. And that's to this day is a real issue.
I mean, I'll add, as I mentioned, I study Arab media, and Al Jazeera English is a perfect example of this on a macro level, because it is a news organization that brings together reporters from literally all over the world, separate from Al Jazeera Arabic, which is all Arab. But Al Jazeera English has, you name it, and they have someone from that country as a reporter, as a producer, as a camera person, and it changes the complete ethos of the news organization. It changes the worldview and how they approach stories. So there is still somewhere in that commonality, and there's a big debate within media scholars of, is there an ethos of journalism that circles the world? And there is an element of that unifies journalists. But there is a very different worldview in an Al Jazeera English newsroom than in a BBC newsroom than in a CBS newsroom. So, last question.
Well, maybe this is I saved the best for last, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My name is George Adams, and I'm intimidated greatly by all of you in this room. Number one, I'm in the Foley House, and being that I consider myself an independent politically, I vote across both aisles. There seems to be a lack of, and I'm intimidated by all of you. I have a couple of degrees from WSU from '82. But I'm honored to be in the presence of so many PhDs, so thank you. But my question to you is this. I'm a product of my environment, 53 years here in Washington State. I'm a small town kid, okay? As such, I've always been kind of a news junkie, even as a little kid, okay? There's been plenty of
comments, whether it's as to whether it was you saying about something about Bill Riley and editing, you think that Bill Riley does editing or something like that. But there's been plenty of plugs through the panels today of perhaps the right and what they do to civility. Okay, 20-some years ago, when Rush Limbaugh came on board, I thought to myself, gee whiz, here's somebody that I'm hearing something from that I'm not getting anyplace else. There was a void. Now he's an entertainer. He is bloviates. He is maybe somewhat of a journalist. I don't know. But here is someone where ABC, CBS, NBC, which were the big three at the time, you didn't get that point of view from them because there was a void. I think that Fox News, I don't get Fox. I mean, I've seen Fox, I know who Riley is, and I have seen Matt Allen Olbermann, I know who they are. But they're a result of a void out here in the public. And so I hear you joke and perhaps somewhat make fun of the vast difference in opinion out here, but it was something that hasn't been addressed in any other way. And so as we go forward in media, I'd like to know what you think, because I'm the little guy out here, okay? I do get my news from the internet. I do get my news from doing as much reading as possible. And yes, on occasion, I do listen to talk radio, and there's a whole plethora of conservative talk out there. And there used to be Air America out there, but because of the free market, it didn't catch on, and there's even two Reagans out there on either end of the spectrum talking. So my question is to you is, how do you fill the void of which I wasn't getting what I would needed out of news in the past and still have the civility out there? Because I hear nothing, I don't hear you presenting a balanced view. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if any of you panelists on any of it have been balanced, because you've all shown your hands. And maybe it's because of the Tom Foley Institute. I don't know. Maybe it's because of Clayton and how he put this thing together. I don't know. But I'm interested in your perspective.
So is the Fox at one end and the Keith Olbermanns and Daily shows at the other a natural corrective to this homogenization of media that we talked about?
Can I throw in, before we answer this, one correction? Because I don't think the problem with Fox News is Glenn Beck. I don't think that the problem is Glenn Beck versus Rachel Maddow. I think the problem with Fox News, and I'm saying this as somebody who can't even vote in this country, so I'm not quite as partisan as you make it out to be. But I think the problem with Fox News is the memos that leaked. I think it was in December, that said, do not talk about the public option. Do not call it the public option. If you do call it public option, in your general news coverage, not in the opinion dispensing shows, that certainly Limbaugh would fit in on talk radio, or that Glenn Beck would fit in, or that Rachel Maddow and everybody else on the left fits in. The problem is that there's a specific language that is predefined in internal memos for general newscasts that says if you call it the public option, call it the so-called public option. What does that go back to? That goes back to the 1994 memo that Frank Luntz put out for the Republicans called The Language for the 21st Century. 220 pages, pre-tested messages of how we have to talk about issues. And this goes back to our discussion earlier about what really discourse means, civil discourse, the generally shared kind of context that we argue positions within a generally shared context. This says, I'm going to frame it for you in a way that influences your interpretation of the issue I'm going to describe without you really knowing. Again, not a Republican problem, because the Democrats tried to do the exact same thing very quickly. They were just behind.
Groups are on both sides.
Exactly. So and so I don't think it's a partisan problem. I think if there has been, that'd be my personal answer, and I can't speak for anybody else. But my only beef with Fox News are those memos that came out and it said, look, we're going to let our opinion side very explicitly bleed into the news side in terms of what kind of terminology we use, and we're willing to even repeat language from the other side. That is, in my opinion, inappropriate for a news channel, and should be inappropriate. So I would very much agree with you in general that you know there's a vacuum for opinion dispensing journalism, and I don't mean it as a value-laden term, and I think that's on both sides. And I think, you know, Rachel Maddow actually gave a great lecture at Harvard last year where she talked about, look, the journalism of the white males reading news, evening news, is over. We struck a new gold mine, and that new gold mine is elsewhere. It's exactly what you're describing. We're filling a void that wasn't there beforehand. But I don't think that's the criticism. I think the criticism is the one of opinion bleeding into normal news, into what should be balanced, objective, whatever news. So I think that would be my answer.
We're all looking for the truth.
Russ?
I empathize with a lot of the things you say, but let me try to highlight the difference. I think our concern about civility and the example of Oberman and Rush Limbaugh or Maddow and Beck isn't about what they say, it's how they say it. Keith Olbermann, the worst person in the world, is not a way to have a civil discourse. And I think underlying the logic of this conference is it is a good example of Tom Foley, from whom the Foley Center is named. You know, last night at the letter that was read, how did it begin? By talking about his Republican colleague and his Republican friend. There's a sense that what we've lost is the civility to respect each other's views and honestly discuss them, and what we've substituted is bombast and entertainment and hyperbole, which takes us away from a reasonable democratic discourse. And since you mentioned PhDs, which in many audiences isn't a compliment.
Certainly not in the newsroom.
Be nice.
But
since we're PhDs, we have to cite somebody. And we began the conference by citing Tocqueville. So let me kind of give you my logic of this by citing Tocqueville kind of at the end to the last and best question. What did Tocqueville say about democracy? And maybe only a Frenchman could say it. But he says, if you love democracy, you have to love it moderately. And the extremism that one sees where you pillorize your opponent, you live on hyperbole, might help with ratings in the short term, but I don't think it encourages the kind of democratic discourse that Tocqueville was impressed with America, that Jefferson said is the basis of American discourse and democracy, that you debate with people and that's how you settle things. And the sense is that for the television journalism, that some of the narrow casting of consequences have been to lose that civility on both sides, that we can have very big differences. Tom Foley and his colleagues, if you want to read a wonderful book, Honor in the House, Foley's time as a member of Congress, or a number of others where they say that we used to disagree, you know, like in the Super Bowl, we played our best game, but when we walked off the field, we shook hands and we respected one another. And I think this conference is generated by the sense that that civility, even among people who disagree, has gone. And those are the two examples on both the left and the right that have come up repeatedly. Not that the voices shouldn't be there. I mean, look, a good example is, how does James Carville and Mary Madeline live together?
Question for the ages.
That's impossible.
That's why they're both on the road a lot, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'd actually ask, how does anyone live with Carville?
Just a quick last response to your question, because I do think Glenn Beck is part of the problem, and I don't want to create equivalencies between left and right. I think Glenn Beck, more than anyone else on cable television, plays on people's fear and susceptibility to conspiracy theories. I don't think there's anyone on the left who does that. And that makes Glenn Beck a particular problem. Unlike, and I don't think, it's not left or right, it's this notion of fear, worry about this, the world's coming to an end as you know it, and here's the conspiracy, and it takes them 3 blackboards to outline that conspiracy, and it shifts every week. But that's the theme of his show, and that's the theme that frightens me.
Let's give the last word to the non-PhD journalist.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder.
Exposing my academic deficiencies.
That was a good thing.
Yeah.
Both.
There's a part of your question that I think is really interesting, and that's it comes back to the sort of master narrative of mainstream journalism, which is about truth-telling and balance, and we really actually do care about being fair and balanced. We just don't make an advertising slogan out of it. And that narrative has, even though it's got flaws, and even though I think sometimes it pushes our reporting to the extremes and leaves out the vast middle, particularly on social issues and things of that sort, it wasn't so much that people in the talk radio era and so on and so forth were filling a void. It's just that's where journalism has lived, at least my kind of journalism has lived, thereby creating, and I think that's largely true for the glory days, if you will, of network television journalism that the Dean was referring to earlier. So that, call it a void, call it an opportunity. Smart people like Roger Ailes and Limbaugh and others have filled it. I live in arguably next to San Francisco, the most liberal city in America, for better or worse. I'm not casting a value judgment, it's true. But the top-rated radio talk show host in our community is a hardcore right-winger. He happens to be somebody who was quite a good journalist in his day before he became a commentator or whatever he is. I think he still could be a good journalist if he wanted to, but he's making his treasure by being a right-wing talk show host, if to use the label. And he saw wisely an opportunity, even in very liberal Portland, Oregon, because of course there's an audience there that he's been quite successful at. So I look at him and I look at others as being very opportunistic. Yeah, okay, maybe that's filling a void, but I think being opportunistic is probably slightly different and more entrepreneurial than just taking the space that the traditional media is not filling.
Well, I thank all of you for being so enterprising and staying with us, and thank you to the panel. Have a good evening.